Good news! On this Shabbat, we celebrate with Israel the announcement of a pending agreement between the United Arab Emirates and Israel to create full diplomatic relations. This is a very big deal and hope-making. So a little bit of context to share, to add to both the details, the nuance of what is the situation and why this is indeed a moment to pause and as Americans, as Israelis, and as UAE members to see a promise of a brighter tomorrow. The United Arab Emirates are composed of 7 kind of city-states, mini-states, that are in the Persian Gulf, close to Iran, and are marked by more moderate Muslim perspectives. These are Sunni countries, more identified with Saudi Arabia than Iran. And for years, many of those Sunni countries, in the shadow of the threat of a more radical Shiite Islam and a group of Ayatollahs in Iran threatening the peace, have been engaged behind the scenes with Israel for what the UAE and other countries like Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman have in common is oil, meaning money, and a desire and an awareness that when the energy shifts to being less reliant on oil, they want to position themselves with the technologies of the future, those technologies that Israel is so adept at developing: medical technology, computer technology, agricultural technology. So what the UAE has is money and quality of looking forward and not allowing the past to necessarily determine its future. Linda and I had the opportunity to spend a couple days in one of those UAE city-states, that is Dubai. We had a tour for the day that we were there, and I want to tell you just a little bit about it, only to highlight the nature of these UAE countries. Our tour guide came to pick us up from the Airbnb where we were staying, and he was going to pick up a number of other tourists, but we were the first, so I had a chance to introduce myself and talk a bit. And I asked him, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Jerusalem. I'm from Palestine." I said, "Really? Were you born in Palestine?" He said, "No. My parents came here in the 1930s, but they were from Palestine. They were from Jerusalem." And clearly, that was still part of his identity. A reminder to me as a Jew in a country that did not have relations with Israel, that it was not a conversation of politics I wanted to get into. And a reminder that for a Muslim, to have roots in Israel was a source of status. Now, remarkably, as I would learn with Linda on our tour, if you are a Emirati, if you're a member of the UAE, naturally born, like he was, because people who had come before about the year 1950 could be naturalized, but not after. But since they had become more affluent, 90% of the people who live in the UAE are foreign workers, Nepalese, India, Sri Lanka, which is why we were curious to go there, because we had been in those countries. And in Dubai, he said, in the course of this day, this is the tallest building in the world. This is the biggest shopping center in the world. This is the biggest light show at night in the world, water light show. This is the largest indoor ski slope in the world. These are the safest streets in the world. This is the most gold in any jewelry store. And notice, no guards. There is no crime in Dubai. What came through was pride. I smiled to myself to think this was like Las Vegas on steroids in terms of lights at night and big buildings. Indeed, claiming to be and were the tallest building in the world. And I smiled to think they did it without any Jews, because as a Jew, we're always looking for what's the backstory of where the Jews had been there or were there and making a big impact. Not necessarily the case. Oil equals money and the opportunity to build. For somebody who is an Emirati, we were told, when you get married, that roughly 10% or even less of the population, the king gives you your own house. And for the rest of your life, you don't have to pay electric bills or water bills. All that's taken care of. And they will send you anywhere in the world for schooling and pay for it. And medical costs are all paid for. If you're a foreign worker, this is more the aside, there is no public education for your children, meaning no benefits for the foreign workers who they don't want to stay indefinitely. As we were leaving on Emirates Airlines, Air Emirates, which is why we stopped, it was a free stop from South Africa to Europe, they announced that the crew on Air Emirates had representatives of 18 different countries. So I said to one of the stewards, is there anybody working on this plane who is a native Emirati? To which they said no. It's only foreign workers on the plane. And that's the nature of these countries. It's quite remarkable and bizarre, frankly, in terms of this economy with one major asset. But in that regard, Air Emirates is one of the most successful airlines in the world. Very comfortable, big planes, very modern, using those workers to create a very positive experience, which is to say, the United Arab Emirates, now headed by its leader, Prince Mohammed bin Zayed, who is of Abu Dhabi, is very progressive, looking to how they can invest in education of its people, build industries like the airlines, so that there will be a future. And so how did this agreement come about? It came about in significant part as an outgrowth of the administration's peace plan, the plan that Jared Kushner had worked on and presented. But the plan said as follows: 30% of the occupied territories on what are more commonly called the West Bank, some referring to it as Judea and Samaria, 30% Israel would be able to annex, leaving 70% and some land swaps, with the expectation of the creation of a Palestinian state. And so that was the promise to the Palestinians. You will have a Palestinian state, but it'll be 1/3 smaller in terms of this contiguous nature. And in a remarkable way, the UAE ambassador to Washington, Yusuf al-Otaba, published a letter in Hebrew in the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot in June, directly warning the larger Israeli community, saying, if Israel annexes that 30% of the West Bank, it would undermine the quiet progress Israel had made with the Gulf Arabs. And so in this agreement, as presented at the White House, that instead of Israeli annexation for a Palestinian state, Israeli non-annexation was promised in return for peace with the UAE. It's not clear from Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent press conference how long that promise of not annexing will be for, if it's temporary or permanent. What is clear is that many of the settlers are unhappy, so that a key member, Bennett, said, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you have missed by making this an agreement a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to annex a significant part of Judea and Shomron. Israel's former ambassador to the United States, Itamar Rabinovitz, and one of Israel's leading historians, said, basically, the Kushner plan generated an asset out of nothing, so that Israel had, in this case, the opportunity to trade peace with the UAE rather than trading land. It was that rare agreement with an Arab country in which peace was traded for peace rather than land for peace. This is the third agreement. There was an agreement with Egypt, then an agreement with Jordan. But this is dramatic, hope-making. Israel and we as Jews have much to celebrate because there is the hope that other moderate Muslim Sunni countries will see this as an opportunity to further themselves by using their wealth with Israel technology to build a better future for themselves, to say that the past will not bury their future. And it's a sign to Mahmoud Abbas, who rejected out of hand the agreement that had been proposed, to say, this is your time to come to the table. If the agreement is not all that you want, then negotiate. And likewise for Israel, this is the opportunity, hopefully looking forward to negotiate, because the Palestinians aren't going anywhere, and nor are the Israelis. It's hope-making to know that Israel's distant Muslim and not so distant neighbors now are growing to accept that Israel is there to stay. And with that, the promise of an unfolding of relationship, the promise of peace. Ribbon Shalom, Master of the universe, we must find gratitude for the leaders in our administration who helped move this peace forward. We express gratitude to the leaders of Israel and the UAE who persisted and had a vision. May their vision unfold into greater surprises, enabling Israel to fully flourish in a world of peace. And together we say, Amen.
Amen.